Welcome, welcome. It's great to see you guys here. It's great to see you guys here, especially since this afternoon is it's like this perfect afternoon to frisk and frolic about in the sunshine. So instead, you're frisking and frolicking in here in verdant Hynson Lounge. Which, anyway, you clearly are the hardcore history and politics and journalism nerds, and you are about to be rewarded. Now, as you know, the Starr Center is all about the past and the present, taking one and making it relevant to the other, but also about tracing continuities between the two, those lines that connect one moment to another across the span of many years or sometimes even centuries. Our guest today, Clay Hynson, is a person who, even more than most of the other friends of the Starr Center, stands with one foot firmly in the present and the other firmly in the past. In fact, he's sort of got a career in the present and a career in the past. Amazing for such a young-looking fellow. Look at him. You too young to even have a present or a past, Clay, just a future, a bright future. Clay is an editor at the op-ed page of the New York Times, assigning and editing articles by some of the world's best-known writers, thinkers, and political leaders. I worked at op-ed myself once upon a time, and I can tell you that it's a job that's very much about right now, right this minute. So a major Supreme Court ruling has just been handed down. What legal scholar can we find who will explain it lambently, elegantly, and cogently in 3 hours? Or just to give you a purely hypothetical example, let's say Margaret Thatcher and Annette Funicello both die on the same day. Okay, how can we find a brilliant writer or biographer who can give us 500 words on each of them, or even better, 1,000 words on both of them? I'd really like to read that. Have you seen any essays on Thatcher and Funicello, kind of parallel lives interwoven? Maureen Dow did it today. Okay, see, I need to read the op-ed page, Clay. Anyhow, I first got to know Clay several years ago through a project called Disunion that some of you may have seen that was in large part Clay's brainchild. He was then preparing to launch it in conjunction with the 150th anniversary of the Civil War. He was planning to report on the events of the Civil War as they happened exactly 150 years later. So, in other words, Clay and his colleagues thenceforth were going to have not only current events of 2013 to cover, but current events of 2013 and 1863. A lot on their collective plate. But with Clay's encouragement, I began writing for the series, and I found that he was a terrific editor and colleague, at first long distance, in that way that, you know, you often don't see an editor's face for months and months after you get to know their voice and their sort of email style, and then we finally met face to face, and I'm glad I can call Clay a friend now as well. But I also quickly learned that Clay had another parallel career as a historian that went beyond just his disunion work. He was also the author of A Nation on Fire, America in the Wake of the King Assassination, which was published by John Wiley in 2009 to considerable acclaim. And he was also just beginning a project that he's now just wrapping up, a new book on the Civil Rights Act of 1964, one of the most landmark pieces of legislation, of course, in American history, which will be published next year in time for the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act. So, in other words, Clay has to keep running on parallel tracks in his mind at all times. 2013 sort of whirring over here, 1863 spinning here, and like 1964 spinning in the middle. I don't know how he manages to pull it off, especially because he and his wife Joanna have two very small kids, Talia and Elliot, who are themselves frisking and frolicking somewhere in Chestertown as we speak. And if that weren't enough, Clay is also a frequent contributor to many national publications, The Atlantic, The New Republic, and Smithsonian. As a native of Tennessee, you might not be surprised to know that another area of expertise of Clay's is whiskey. In fact, it just occurred to me as I said that maybe whiskey is the secret to how you keep all these things going and keep your sort of sang-froid going on. Anyway, he has a book about to come out, yet another book, American Whiskey, Bourbon, and Rye, A Guide to the Nation's Favorite Spirit, which is scheduled for publication next fall. So in any event, I'm very glad that we have this opportunity to extract Clay from the daily demands of the New York Times and bring him here to Chestertown to ponder history 24/7, as everyone does in Chestertown. That's what we do here. We ponder history 24/7. Even though, sad to say that it's only just for a week, Clay is here as the recipient of the 2013 Frederick Douglass Fellowship, which brings to campus every year a distinguished writer or historian or artist who's working on a subject related to African American and other, in the words of the donor, minority American history. We've had some very interesting people in the past, and we're fortunate to have Clay. We're also fortunate because the fellowship encourages our visiting fellows to spend time with Washington College students while they're here, and in fact, Clay is being very generous with his time with many of our students, not just history majors, but also some of the leaders of the campus journalism community. And I'm especially grateful for that because Clay has actually promised me that he will give each and every one of those students a job at the New York Times immediately upon graduation. Is that correct, Clay? Yeah. Oh, see, he said it. He said, do you have that on film, Corey? Okay, we're golden. But seriously, though, the last thing I'd like to tell you about Clay is that he's been a great friend and facilitator of the Starr Center's New York Times project that a number of students in this room worked on last year called Historically Corrected. He was the editor and godfather of that series that you may remember, and he's also moving forward with us on a new New York Times project for the future, so keep your eyes peeled. And welcome, Clay Risen.
Well, I don't think I can live up to that, but thank you, Adam, very much, and thank you to the Starr Center, both for having me here, but also for, I speak on behalf of my publication, for being a great friend of the New York Times. And Adam has, like he said, done, let's just say he was being a little modest, he did some fantastic work and extensive work for the Disunion Project. I don't think we could have made it a success the way it has been without Adam's contributions. But also the Historically Corrected project has been a real boon for us on the op-ed page, with drawing a lot of readers and also commenters, people debating the historical topics that Adam and Peter and the community here have brought to the reader's attention. So with that, I want to jump into my talk tonight, and hopefully I'll have enough time at the end we can have an extensive conversation. Obviously, I'm not going to be able to talk about everything regarding the Civil Rights Act, so I just want to focus on a few topics that have been of interest to me in preparing the book. But then afterward, feel free to ask any sort of questions related to the bill, related to the movement at the time. Hopefully I can help shed a little light on your question. So what I wanted to talk tonight a little bit about is sort of push back against the conventional story of the Civil Rights Act. The conventional story kind of goes a little bit like this. It's November 1963. It always starts in November 63. The bill languishes in the House. It's just gone into the House Rules Committee, which is this hall of horrors for progressive civil rights legislation. It's run by a guy named Howard Smith. He's Judge Howard Smith, and he's a Virginia legislator who is just an arch segregationist, an enemy of anything liberal, progressive in the world. And it's his job as the chairman of the Rules Committee to shut down that legislation. The Rules Committee approves legislation that's come out of the different subject committees before it goes to the House floor. So he has the power to say no. So the bill is there, and he's essentially said no. And then suddenly Kennedy is killed. And his successor, his vice president, is Lyndon Johnson, the master of the Senate. He comes in and uses his formidable political skills to defeat Smith, move the bill to the House, move it through the Senate, defeat an epic filibuster, and sign the bill into law on July 2nd, 1964. Now, that's all correct. That all happened, and it's all true as far as it goes, but it's not the whole story. And to me, and at least I'll argue tonight, it's not even the really important story. In particular, it leaves out a lot of things, but in particular, it pays very short shrift to the work done by John F. Kennedy and his administration as well as the bill's supporters in the House, in both parties, in the summer and fall of 1963. So before the conventional story even begins, there's a whole lot of things that happen that have essentially been left out of the conventional wisdom. And in fact, I would argue that it's this period that we really deserve to spend more time looking at, that deserves much more attention than the fireworks of the filibuster. It's this time when not only the bill was shaped, but the fragile alliance between liberal Democrats and Republicans and conservative Midwestern Republicans, when the alliance between these two groups was forged, that really became the driving force behind the bill as it moved through the House and then onto the Senate. So first I'd like to give a little background, just to give you the lay of the land. In the post-war years, as we all know, the Democrats had more or less a continuous hold on both houses in Congress. There were a few periods of Republican control, but basically the Democrats were in charge, and certainly the liberals were in charge. But the Democratic Party was split between the hardcore, very senior Southern Democrats. It was both in the House and the Senate. They controlled a lot of the committees. They had seniority, and the rest of the party, the National Democrats. And so it meant that the party as a whole didn't have the kind of power that you might think it did, given the numbers. At the same time, you had a conservative alliance with, you had a conservative wing of the Republican Party that was often in alliance with the Southern Democrats. They both had conservative leanings as far as political views went, as far as social legislation went, and the Midwestern Republicans didn't really care about civil rights legislation, but they didn't see a reason to back it, and they were certainly willing to support the Southern Democrats when the Southern Democrats would support them on fiscal conservative issues. But starting in the early 60s, this started to change. First of all, Johnson, with the 57 Act, the 57 Civil Rights Act, which was not a particularly important bill in the substance, but a very important bill substantially, symbolically. It showed that alliance could be broken. It showed that really Lyndon Johnson, the master of the Senate, was able to figure out how to pull away Midwestern Republicans away from this conservative alliance. But part of the reason he was able to was that you had a new era of conservatism emerging among these, particularly the younger members of the House and Senate Republican caucus. Guys like Gerald Ford and Melvin Laird from Wisconsin, these were people who were certainly conservative, and they were certainly Republicans, but they also were very uncomfortable with the idea of having an alliance with segregationists for political reasons. They didn't believe in it, they didn't agree with it, and they didn't feel comfortable making that deal. So they started to push against it. And at the same time, you had some of the older leaders starting to take really moral stands, and people who could very well have stuck with the conservative alliance, starting to say, look, I've had enough of this. It's 1963. We need to move on as a country. The country is moving on. We need to move on. These were guys like Charles Halleck, who was the minority leader, the Republican minority leader from Indiana. Very much a partisan Republican. But when it came to civil rights, he was starting to question his party's, or his sort of faction of the party's, commitment to opposing it. Bill McCulloch, who was a small-town lawyer from Ohio, he was the quietly respected man that everyone looked to, but no one in the public really paid too much attention to. He was the ranking minority member of the Judiciary Committee. So he had sort of informal power within the group. And these guys were starting to say, maybe these young guys have something. So at the same time, so you have that sort of happening with the Republican Party. At the same time, on the Democrat side, the National Democrats, the liberals, were pushing constantly. I mean, this was for decades. They've been pushing constantly, trying to figure out how to get civil rights legislation through. Are there certain, they hoped for a while that the Southern Democrats might start to modernize and that some of them might come over. Well, that didn't happen. They thought maybe we can find some ways to break the conservative alliance. Without Johnson, they couldn't really see how to do that. Their strategy, and it was really sort of set in stone by the early 60s, was to say, okay, here's what we're going to do. we're going to take a bill, when we write the bill, we're going to load it up with everything we can think of. We're going to make it just this massive bill. Something that could never pass, right? It'll be a wish list. And as we move the bill through the House and through the Senate, we'll cast stuff off. It'll be like a ship in a storm. We'll throw away this plank and that plank so that by the end, we'll come out and we'll have this little bill. And maybe it won't do very much, but it'll be progress and it'll be something. And we're going to do that over and over and over. Well, as you can imagine, that's not a very engaging, very titillating strategy. So it was something that the liberals pushed, most moderates didn't get behind, and certainly didn't go anywhere. So basically what you have by early 1963, and I should mention you also have a president John F. Kennedy, who was a liberal, but was not really someone who put a lot of weight behind civil rights. He was, certainly if you asked him, he believed in civil rights, but he had other priorities. He was, like most people in the country, like most white people in the country outside the South, frankly, he had never really met a lot of black people. He didn't spend any time in situations that would expose him to the moral imperatives of overturning Jim Crow, of pushing against segregation. So I'm not to excuse him, but this is the kind of person he was. And he just didn't see the point in pushing civil rights legislation that wasn't going to go anywhere, right? He didn't want to throw a lot of political capital that he could spend on a tax cut or on military spending or the Peace Corps. He didn't want to waste that away on a piece of legislation that he didn't think could pass. So basically, 1963, starting off, you have a lot of potential and nothing happening. You have a bunch of different groups in the Congress who want to see civil rights move forward, but they don't trust each other. They don't see how it can happen, and they kind of have their own ways of going about it. So, and meanwhile, you have a president who has a lot of moral authority, has a lot of charisma, but isn't willing to spend that on civil rights as an issue. Everyone just kind of at the end of the day, and there are some great interviews from people in the early 63. And this is 1963, right? This is the year of Birmingham. This is the year when Meg Revers is killed. This is the year of the March on Washington. We think of this as this high point of the Civil Rights Act, or of the Civil Rights Movement. And you begin 1963 on a low point. Everyone's saying, I just kind of hope it'll go away. Like, eventually, we're all smart people. America's a smart place. We'll move past it, right? That was the hope of the average right-thinking American, the right-thinking white American, obviously. Then comes Birmingham. 1963, April and May of 1963, Martin Luther King leads several thousand demonstrators, many of them children, in protests in the streets of Birmingham, and he sets off a violent confrontation, very much a one-sided violent confrontation, from the police force, the Birmingham police force. We've all seen the pictures of the dogs and the firehouses, and this was all over the world. I mean, it's not an exaggeration to say that it shocked the entire globe. It also embarrassed us dramatically because you can imagine the communists across the world loved these photographs. They showed how awful a place America was. So it had an enormous influence. It had an enormous impact in Washington. It's one of those situations where everyone knew at the time, and it has remained true. There's no revisionist history for this. This event did change history, the Birmingham protests. Right away, the White House said, we have to do something. We have to move on this. And when I say the White House, I actually just mean John F. Kennedy. Kennedy's advisors said no. Kennedy's advisors said, look, it's going to go away. Don't worry about it. There have been protests before. We have other issues. We have other things we need to press. Bobby Kennedy, however, who was the Attorney General, but also his brother's closest advisor, Bobby Kennedy had been dealing with civil rights, had been thinking through the issue for a while now, and Birmingham really solidified in his mind the need for action. And Bobby Kennedy's staff as well. It's Burke Marshall, who was the head of the Civil Rights Division, Nick Katzenbach, who was then his deputy attorney general. These men agreed with him and said, yes, we need legislation. We need to do something. And so John F. Kennedy didn't need much convincing. He said, yes, I now understand the moral imperative. Let's do something. So in June of 1963, he tells Bobby to have at it. and Kennedy and his deputies sit down and they write a bill, basically over a weekend. And it's not just the minimum. It's not just answering what the protesters want. It's a huge bill. It includes all sorts of things that no one expected Kennedy to ever embrace. It was stronger voting rights protections. It was an expansive, comprehensive ban on discrimination in public accommodations, not just government-owned public accommodations, but anything that served the public. There were some limits, and this was the source of consternation from liberals later, rightly so, because there were certain things that were left out. But it was nevertheless a revolutionary proposal. There was a timetable for school integration. You know, the Brown decision 9 years earlier had only been a Supreme Court decision. It didn't put any meat on the bones, right? You could sue because of that decision. If you were an African-American parent whose child was prevented from going to school, you could sue, but that meant you had to have money, you had to have time. So there was no federal government backing. So this bill said, no, now we're going to get behind that decision. We're going to make people integrate schools. And there was also a title called Title VI, which ended up being one of the most important pieces of legislation, or important pieces of the legislation. People didn't see it at the time, but it was a cutoff of federal funds for programs that discriminated. So if the federal government gave money to, let's say, a school or to a jobs program in Mississippi, and the jobs program only gave assistance to white people, well, the federal government would cut that off. And this became, as you can imagine, as the federal government expanded, an enormous piece of leverage. But at the time, people didn't see it that way. Anyway, so that was the bill that was written. Katzenbach and Burke Marshall essentially wrote it. Bobby Kennedy was involved. But even more important than the details of what those guys were doing was the strategy that they then came up with. And this was the strategy that played out through the entire course of the bill, long after Kennedy had been assassinated. This was a strategy that was concocted within the Department of Justice. Lyndon Johnson had very little to do with it. In fact, Johnson was saying there were other things that should have been done. And these guys said, no, there are three things that we have to do. The first thing is the action has to start in the House, right? You can have a bill start in either house, but they said the House is where it has to happen because the House is dominated by liberals. So we know we can get a bill through. But we need the momentum of that bill in order to push it through in the Senate, where we know there will be a filibuster. And filibusters have killed untold numbers of civil rights bills in the past. So we need to get a running start. So the second thing is that we have to have conservative Republicans on board right from the beginning, right? Because not only are there 100 Southern Democrats in the House, but there are probably enough Southern Democrats and Midwestern Republicans who, without pulling away some of those Republicans, enough of that faction, that conservative alliance, to sustain a filibuster. So we need to start pulling in those guys immediately, convincing them to back a bill that is actually a pretty tall order. This is a partisan bill. This is a John F. Kennedy bill that's being introduced. It's not bipartisan, right? It's John F. Kennedy bill, at least at the beginning. And this is going into an election year in '64. So Republicans might obviously ask themselves, why would we want to support the president on this issue? So you have to convince them. So the third thing is doing that means controlling the liberal faction, both the Republican liberals, of which back then there were many, and also the Democratic liberals, who were going to very fairly push for more aggressive, more expansive civil rights legislation. So the point was, we want a strong bill, but not one that's too strong that forces away the conservative Republicans. So this takes a lot of finesse, right? And if this is not a strategy that's being developed in the House. It's not something that Congress is deciding. It's something that's being decided from the Department of Justice, right? These guys are saying, we're going to run this. And it goes very much against our understanding not only of how legislation worked back then, right? The president proposes, the Congress disposes, but also our impression of how Kennedy and the Kennedy White House worked, right? We think that they were very hands-off, very sort of, two left feet when it came to Congress. But here they were grabbing this bull and saying, we're going to drive this right through the stable gates. So one of the first things they did, on the 4th of July weekend, Burke Marshall, who is the head of the Civil Rights Division, he flies out to Piqua, Illinois, and all the congressmen had gone home for the long weekend vacation. That's where Bill McCulloch lived. He was the ranking minority member on the House Judiciary Committee, and he was really the guy that everyone sort of quietly looked up to in the Republicans. But he was also very conservative. He was also very distrustful of Democrats, because this was a guy who, he's sort of an unsung hero in the civil rights legislative history. Not only did he propose multiple bills, but he also very often worked to get his followers, his sort of, his clique in the Republican Party to follow him to back civil rights legislation. And remember, these are people who don't need to back civil rights legislation. These are guys who don't have more than a handful of blacks in their constituencies. So they need to be convinced that it's a moral reason, or else they need to be given some reason. Bill McCulloch did that time and again. But time and again, the bills that he would back in the House, remember these big bills that they would load up with all sorts of baggage and then throw that baggage off as they went through, those would inevitably be whittled down to these tiny little, almost meaningless pieces of legislation. And many of them failed anyway. Some of them got through, but most of them failed. So Bill McCulloch wanted to support civil rights, but he didn't believe that the Democrats were honest when they came to him. So Burke Marshall said, what do I need to do? I'm honest, right? I'm telling you, it's not Congress doing it this time. It's us. It's the Department of Justice, and we're 100% behind it. We're taking a big risk. We don't have to do this. We're doing it. So what do we need to do? And McCulloch said two things. First of all, the bill needs to make sense. It can't be one of these loaded up bills. It has to be something that's designed to get through. It has to answer current pressing issues, and it has to be something that doesn't get whittled down as we go through. You need to make that commitment to me. So Burke Marshall said, yeah, I can do that. You've seen our bill. You know what we're proposing. It's a pragmatic bill. It's big. It's revolutionary, but we think right now there's the climate out there. And indeed there was. The polls showed that the public generally supported civil rights at unprecedentedly high levels for the moment. Burke Marshall said, well, we know we can do this, so let's go ahead and do it. Let's push this through. So McCulloch said, okay, we'll do it. So the bill immediately goes to the House Judiciary Committee, and the man who runs the Judiciary Committee is an old New York politician named Emanuel Seller, Manny Seller, who is this avuncular, very much a veteran, sort of old politician. He was loved opera. He's one of these quirky guys that, I don't know, they don't really show up in the House anymore, but they used to be. You used to find these guys in these stories about House politicians. They're just very colorful figures. He was one of these guys. He was also, kids loved him because he was great with magic tricks. And he actually had, and you hear about this, the stereotype, right? But you never see it. He was great with rabbit tricks. His trick, he had all these tricks with rabbits and hats, right? No one actually does those things, right? In reality, you never see a magician do that. Well, he actually could do them, and he did them. So kids loved that. He was also, if you're a real political geek, he has the sad distinction of being the most senior member of the House of Representatives to ever lose a primary race. In 1972, he lost his 26th primary race to. Actually, now I'm forgetting. Who did he lose? He lost to Elizabeth Holtzman, which is her singular significance. But in any case, so Seller was this guy. People tended to like him, but he was also a very inconsistent politician. Sometimes he ran his committee with an iron fist. Other times he just kind of let it float along. And this time he said, okay, I'll run this with an iron fist. Don't worry, John, I can do this. I'll get this bill through exactly as you've given it to me, and it'll be no problem. So immediately he pulls it in, and the first step when you have a bill in Congress is it goes to a subcommittee. The subcommittee is the specialist committee. So there wasn't a civil rights committee, and what Seller did was he said, well, I'm going to put it in my personal committee. I have this personal committee that technically does antitrust, but it's also where, because I'm this dictator, I can say any bill I want comes to my bill, comes to my committee. So don't worry, John, I can do it. I've got my little committee. We're going to do it. Well, the hearings go on all summer, right? And the subcommittee met 22 different times. They took 100 witnesses, testimony from 100 witnesses, 1,742 pages of testimony, which I have my own sad distinction of having read, and it's there's some great stuff in it, but it's about 1,500 of those pages are not all that exciting. Then in August, the committee goes into executive session, which is what committees do. It's sort of the secret, off limits, the public can't come in period where they actually sit down and they say, okay, we've heard all the testimony, we've got the bill, what do we want to do to it? How do we want to change it? What do we think? We're the experts. What do we want to do? Even the Department of Justice was kicked out. Katzenbach and Marshall had been promised they could sit in. They were kicked out. And things immediately go off the rails. So one of the problems, and they should have seen this coming, was that even though Seller said he had control over this committee, the committee was made up mostly of liberals. And I'm not trying to demean liberals at all. It may sound like it, but they certainly had their set of policies that they wanted to advocate. And one of the failings of the Kennedy administration was that they didn't pay enough attention to these guys. And these guys had serious plans. They said, well, we've got our own bills. We kind of want to push our bills, and we think that Kennedy is underestimating the public sentiment out there. We think we can actually get something bigger through. And Seller says, okay, if you say so, basically. And he lets these guys load up the bill with all sorts of other stuff. And the liberals had a majority, and liberals, Democrats, and Republicans. They had a majority on this subcommittee. So they put in a Fair Employment Practices Commission, which today we know is the EEOC, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. So they created that, but they gave it cease and desist powers, right? Basically gave it legal authority or judicial authority. They extended federal voting rights, the federal voting rights package, to the states, right? So the federal government was going to tell the states how to run their elections, which had been held to be unconstitutional in the past. And they also added something called Title III authority, which was this sort of the cream on the top of the wish list of civil rights liberals. It was basically giving power to the Attorney General to sue any civil rights violation, right? So they could go in and sue anytime someone ostensibly violated another person's civil rights, which sounds great, but unchecked, you can imagine in the hands of the wrong Attorney General, it could be kind of scary, right? Because, well, there are a lot of rights, and this wasn't limited to those, right? So, anyway, this bill comes out in early October, and it doesn't look anything like what had gone in. Bill McCulloch was on the subcommittee, but he was more or less powerless. He was outvoted. He comes out, and as soon as the bill comes out, these guys can speak publicly. And Bill McCulloch says, this is a pail of garbage. I can't accept this. All the other conservative Republicans say, I can't back this. The Department of Justice, the White House, they're up in arms. They can't believe that Seller just completely screwed up. The people who are happy, obviously the liberals are happy, but who else was happy was the Southern Democrats, because they saw this bill and they said, you know what, no moderate out there, no conservative Republican, no one who might have voted for this bill earlier is going to vote for this version. So we are all for this version. We're going to vote for this version all the way up to the filibuster, and then it's going to die, right? So so immediately this bill comes out, and instead of stopping, it starts to generate momentum. There's certain people who want to see this bill start going. That's where the White House comes in. First, Kennedy says, first thing we have to do is get a hold of Seller. We have to get him back. We have to sort of get a tight rein on him. So they call him in, they call him on the carpet. John Kennedy and separately Bobby Kennedy, they just chew him out, right? And these are young guys. They're chewing out a guy who's almost twice their age, right? Chair of the Judiciary Committee, one of the most senior members of the House, both in terms of years and in terms of power. They chew him out. They say, Manny, you screwed up. You sold us down the river. What happened? And he says, I don't know, guys. They overpowered me. Whatever. He sort of gives his excuses, and they say, okay, from now on, you're off the table, right? You're going to sit over here. You're going to take orders from us. We're in control. And they deputize Nick Katzenbach to go to McCulloch, hat in hand, and say, look, we're really sorry. This is not our fault, right? What can we do to solve it? McCulloch says, look, I'm incredibly angry with what happened, but I believe you. Burke Marshall is a good guy. He promised me that we would have a good bill. So here's what we're going to do. First of all, we're going to rewrite the bill, you and me, right? So not even the AG, but the deputy AG and not that someone other than the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, the House, the minority ranking member, they're going to rewrite this piece of legislation. Now, today, this might happen occasionally, right? This kind of involvement. Back then, this never happened. The idea that someone other than the chairman and someone other than a congressman would sit down and wholesale rewrite a bill was anathema to tradition, to the expectations, and yet this is what the Kennedy administration was willing to do, and it was what they were able to do. They were able to go in and off the cuff rewrite this bill. Katzenbach was an absolute legislative genius, on top of being just a general genius. But he proved to be a legislative genius. There are lots of stories about him, but it's for another time. Anyway, so he sits down with McCulloch, they rewrite the bill. Basically, they rewrite the bill to be a compromise between what was originally submitted and what came out. In fact, the bill ends up being a lot stronger than Kennedy had initially created. McCulloch turns out to not actually be that opposed to the bill, the new bill, right? He says, look, to be honest, I'm for civil rights. All I want to do is make sure the bill gets through. So, and I want some credit among the conservative Republicans for having, taken you guys to the woodshed. So give me something here. He says, I can't accept a Fair Employment Practices Commission with cease and desist powers, but I can take one that has the power to sue in a court. So, okay, well, that's still pretty powerful, right? Can sue a company for discriminating against employees. That's still pretty powerful. So Kennedy says, okay. He says, we need to get rid of Title III, right, this AG power. He says, well, let's get rid of Title III. But they said, well, let's actually narrow it down, limit it to schools, right? So Title III, so the Attorney General can sue when it comes to school discrimination. Okay, well, that's pretty good. And there were a few other things, a few other tweaks that he made, but actually the bill ended up being pretty good. And my colleague says, okay, I'll back this bill, I'll push it through. The one thing I can't do is promise that Charlie Halleck will back this bill. Because Charlie Halleck, he listens to me, he takes my advice, but he's senior. He's senior to me. He runs the House Republicans, right? I can't promise that he'll back this. So the next thing Kennedy does is he goes to Halleck. He says, Halleck, we need to talk. We need to figure out how to get this bill through. Halleck says, look, you've screwed us over. You have no control over Seller. You have no control over your guys. How can I trust you? And Kennedy essentially says, first of all, you can trust me. And second of all, I'm putting everything I have behind this bill. Right? This Kennedy comes out that no one expected and that we've forgotten about today. Kennedy says to McCulloch, or it says to Halleck, I will destroy you. Right? I will destroy you guys. If you back out now, I will make sure that you pay for it. I will run on civil rights next year. If I don't get my bill, I will run on civil rights, and I will blame you for not getting this bill through, and you will pay for it. And, that's pretty daring. So, sure enough, Halleck, the next day, this is the day before the Judiciary Committee is supposed to vote on the bill. Remember, the Judiciary Committee now has two bills they can vote on, right? The bill that came out of the subcommittee, and the compromise. So Halleck comes out at the last minute, and he says, okay, I'll back it, I promise. And he tells the GOP, the Republicans, we have to back this bill. And he goes especially to the GOP members of the Judiciary Committee. He says, you guys have to vote for it. You have to back it. And they follow him, and they do it, and the bill squeaks through the Judiciary Committee. It just makes it through, right, by a couple of votes. Meanwhile, of course, the Democrats were wrangling their own guys, and the White House was doing their work with the Republicans. But it was really this ability to reach out to the other party and both to kiss up to them and also to put a stranglehold on them that shows a level of political sophistication and finesse that we don't associate with the Kennedy White House. And by the way, Halleck suffered immensely for this. Arguably, Halleck lost his position as minority leader the next year, and a lot of people blame him for this. They say, well, he kind of took his own, took leave of the rest of us. He didn't listen to us. He didn't talk to us. He sort of made his own decision, and we don't want that kind of a guy around. But Halleck, interestingly, was okay with that. When Kennedy at the very last minute, the last conversation he had with Halleck, Kennedy said, are you okay doing this? Are you okay? And he said, sometimes you just have to do what you think is right. Sometimes you just have to tell the other guys to walk. And that's what I'm going to do now. Much later, someone asked him why he did what he did. This was after the repercussions were obvious. And he said, and this is interesting, he said, once in a while, a guy does something because it's right. He said, I had a few experiences. I had a black driver. And we used to go down, this is from, he lived in Indiana. He said, we used to go down to Warm Springs, Virginia to visit friends. And along the way, we'd stop at some little restaurant. And I'd go in and ask if, the driver could come sit at our table and eat with us. And they would say, this being Virginia, Jim Crow, Virginia, they would say, no, but we'll bring him something out. And Halleck said, I just left. I couldn't deal with that. I said, there's that wasn't right. And so that's why he went and basically basically sacrificed his political leadership, his political power for this piece of legislation. And I think it's interesting that he did that because it speaks to a kind of political courage that you don't see very often. And it also speaks to something that you see throughout the history of the Civil Rights Act, which is this sort of coming from very interesting corners. Individual representatives or senators you would think wouldn't normally back a bill like this, who later on or even at the time said, I had an experience once. I was in the South, or I was talking to a congressman from the South, and they just something horrible came out of their mouth. I mean, the reality of Southern racism was really exposed to me, and that changed my life, and it changed my views, and it made me willing to take a lot of risks to back transformative legislation. And it's similar in some ways, I think, to the way that today you hear a lot of people speak about gay marriage and gay rights. Conservatives who say, normally I would be expected not to feel this way, but my son, my daughter, my friend, someone I've met along the way, had a particular story that really affected me personally. So you see that a lot with civil rights legislation. So anyway, to kind of wrap up. So the bill passes, and it goes to the Rules Committee, and there it sits, as I said, with Judge Smith. Sitting on top of it, Smith says, I'm going to have my own hearings. I don't want to just let this bill go through. I'm going to have my own hearings. It's going to be several months before we do anything. November 22nd, Kennedy is killed. The conventional story now begins. And I don't want to slight the immense capabilities or actions that Lyndon Johnson took immediately after taking office to get the bill through. But what I do want to say is, in the same way that you can't understand the New Testament without understanding the Old Testament, you really can't understand this Senate side of the story, this Lyndon Johnson side of the story, without understanding the Kennedy side of the story and the House side of the story. And it was Kennedy and his team, not Johnson, who set the game plan. And it was they who identified the need for a bipartisan, conservative Republican and liberal Republican and Democrat coalition to get the bill through. And they figured out how to do it. And that's something that you just don't think of the Kennedy administration being able to do. Now, a lot of people accuse Kennedy of being a mediocre president, of being, great image, great, very moving guy, very charismatic, but not someone who got a lot of legislation through. But I think that the Civil Rights Act proves otherwise. And it's true that the bill still had 7 months to go and a lot of water to carry before Lyndon Johnson was able to sign it. But it was Kennedy's performance on the bill and his ability to identify the points of weakness among the different factions and bring them together, manipulate them to push through the bill, and his ability to craft the piece of legislation, his ability and the ability of his deputies, which were appointed by him and very much worked in coordination with him. So I'd argue that on this issue, where it really counted, Kennedy proved to be as much a master of congressional politics as his vaunted successor, Lyndon Johnson. So with that, I know I'm a little over, but I'd like to just open the floor to questions, if anyone has any. And we'll actually, let's see, this gentleman and then this gentleman.
My name is Alvin Bronstein. I was many years a lawyer, senior lawyer for the ACLU, the National Assembly. King went down to St. Augustine, Florida in the spring of 1964 because he was worried about the bill not being passed. And he knew that St. Augustine was a major issue. You may recall St. Augustine was preparing to celebrate its anniversary as oldest city founded by another country in America. And they received hundreds of thousands of dollars from the federal government. And Dr. King was outraged by that because they were a terrible city when it came to treatment of black people. There was a single motel there that would serve a black person, and they had a significant black population. There wasn't a single black person allowed to march. Dr. King was getting arrested daily. I was sent down there by the ACLU before I went to Mississippi to set up this other office. Got Dr. King and Mrs. Peabody out of jail. Mrs. Peabody, the mother of the governor of Massachusetts. And Dr. King was really hitting the press with this stuff. And I think it was Dr. King's activity down there, which was very well reported in the press, that had a big impact on people in the Congress.
Oh, I absolutely agree. And like I said at the beginning, I think the conventional story leaves out a lot of things. I was really wanted to focus on one thing, but one of the other things that it tends to leave out is the role that the movement, particularly Dr. King, had not only on instigating the legislation, right? Birmingham was very important, but continuing to bring pressure through the course of the March on Washington is often, even at the time, some people said, well, that was very nice, but it won't mean anything to the representatives and the senators. But what it did do was it demonstrated to the country that not only did African Americans have grievances, but that they could come together and express them. And, you know, to be perfectly honest, a lot of people were worried that something bad would happen, and it didn't. Obviously, it proved to be a great moral high point in American history, and people saw that. And you're right, absolutely right. St. Augustine was very critical, especially during the Senate filibuster. People were able to go home at night and read the papers and say, this is exactly what we're talking about. I think that's an excellent point. And it's a major part of the book. Yes, sir.
At what point in time of the story you tell did sex discrimination enter the scene?
That's a
Because, as you know, and I guess most people know, that the first 1964 Civil Rights Act goes to the Supreme Court deals with sex discrimination.
right.
Does that come in through the Senate?
Well, it's a funny story, and it's an important part, obviously, of the story, but it's an important part of the story that I'll tell. And if I had had more time, I certainly would have talked about that, because the person who introduced it was Judge Howard Smith from the Rules Committee. Now, there's a lot of debate about why Howard Smith introduced the bill. It happened on the floor of the House, and there's a great. It was the WAGs in Washington called it Ladies' Day, because immediately he offered this proposal, and people started joking and laughing and saying, oh, well, why would we include that? Or, you know, the older guys all sort of looked at that and said, well, that, you know, they would actually, Emanuel Seller was one of the guys who sort of dismissed it with some vaguely sexist jokes, and or not even vaguely sexist, they were very sexist jokes. And, you know, saying, oh, women have lots of power now. I can't even get a word in edgewise at home. I mean, this shticky stuff that, but what was amazing was the bill, it actually ended up being supported. And a majority of people, members in the House voted for it, and it stayed in. Now, the debate is, why did Howard Smith do it, right? He said at the time, and a lot of people argued afterward, that it was simply to kill the bill, right? That enough people would oppose it after that it would be sort of toxic to the old boys who were in the House and in the Senate, that they would vote against the bill. And I don't think that that's wrong. I think that Howard Smith did have that in mind. He said as much. But he also, if you look at his biography, Howard Smith had this weird sort of background where he was very much in favor of women's rights. He had always voted for the Equal Rights Amendment. He was personal friends with Alice Paul, who was a major feminist leader, major backer of the early backer of the ERA, the head of the National Women's Party. And she had convinced him in the fall of '63 to add this as a piece of legislation. His justification was, look, if this bill protects black people, white men are already protected, white women are not going to be protected. So we need this in order to protect them. That was her argument to him, and he agreed with that. So his support for it was sort of two-sided. And what's unfortunate is, for many years after the bill was passed, both the EEOC and courts at various levels would side simply with that sort of the joking, fluke, sabotage theory, right? They would say, well, sex isn't supposed to be there. It's only there because this arch segregationist tried to kill the bill. So it's a fluke. There's no reason for it to be there. We're just going to ignore it. And there's a very good case. And in fact, a lot of people have done this historical work. I can't claim this to be my original work. There's been some very interesting work in the archives done recently that makes the case that Smith actually did not only plan to bring the bill, to put that in for reasons other than trying to sabotage it, but that through the course of the legislative debate, both with this bill and on civil rights in general through the years, there was a lot of consideration of adding sex discrimination to any kind of employment bill or any kind of employment discrimination bill. So it was wrong for the EEOC to later say, well, there's no legislative history here. This is just a fluke. No, actually, it really was something that was intended to be there. The old boy network simply didn't like that.
What did the Kennedy White House do when that amendment appeared? Did they, obviously,
You know, yeah. Well, at that point, it was Johnson. And because it didn't enter into the bill until it was on the floor. So this was late January 26th, 1964. And, you know, Johnson said, I could take it or leave it. Johnson didn't actually think it would hurt the bill that much. He politically said, you know, the chances of it winning or losing 1 or 2 votes is not really worth killing it and the political capital that would come with that. Because when it was added, women's groups everywhere were coming out of the woodwork. They said, this is great. This is what we wanted. And it's telling that actually on the day that it was voted, dozens, I mean, as many women as could pack into the gallery were there to watch it. This was a Saturday. It was a Saturday session. All these people were there. This meant something. It was something that wasn't a fluke. It was really a historic moment. And so Johnson said, look, yeah, I'm not going to try to pull that out unless something really looks deadly. So, and it ended up not being that important. So, sure. Yes, sir.
even with one of these, how much is all the groundwork done by the Kennedy administration, it's still true, isn't it? It's almost inconceivable that the Civil Rights Bill would have passed in 1964 without the transformational landscape caused by Kennedy's assassination.
It's hard. It's an impossible question to answer. I mean, it's an impossible. Repeat the question. He said, well, isn't it true that all this being said, the bill could never have made it through to Johnson's desk if Kennedy hadn't been killed? And you can certainly make that argument. And it's certainly true that people rallied behind the bill, in a way, both public and certain members of Congress, because it was Kennedy's bill. And they said, well, we owe it to the president. What that meant in terms of votes, ultimately you can't say. I mean, you can say that there aren't that many people in the Senate who, on the record, said, I'm voting for this because of Kennedy, because Kennedy was killed. There are very few people who said, I'm voting for this bill because Lyndon Johnson is making me do it, right? Johnson's influence, well, but that's actually part of the story, right? The conventional wisdom is that Johnson went in and used his power to force a bunch of senators to vote for the bill. But there's actually very little evidence that he did that with anyone. There's one person, Carl Hayden, who Johnson did more or less win over. Everyone else who moved over, it was a result of work by the Johnson White House But these were all guys who stayed over from the Kennedy White House. These are guys, Katzenbach and Burke Marshall and Mike Manitos and Larry O'Brien and all these people who sort of came from the White House to scour the halls of Congress every day to make sure the bill survived. So it's one of those questions. It's, if Lee had had better artillery at Gettysburg, yes, maybe. I think there is evidence for that case, but I also think that there's strong evidence that the bill had so much momentum behind it by the time Kennedy was killed that as long as the right decisions were made, it was going to make it.
Maybe there's a question from the student.
Is there a question from the student? Well, think of some. I'll get to these guys, and then I'll come back to you. Let's see. Okay. You, and then I'll take the gentleman in the back.
What did you discover about the legislative history of Title X, which was sort of the softer side of civil rights enforcement, the creation of a conciliation service for race relations?
Well, it's interesting. It's the idea had been around for several years. Johnson was one of the first advocates of a civil rights service, or a community relations service, is what it was called. It was interesting. It was proposed, actually, as far as a part of this bill, it was originally included by the White House and then was removed. Bill McCulloch, for a variety of reasons, didn't want it to stay in there. The White House didn't actually care. But then they sort of included it. They borrowed a little bit from the liberal strategy. They said, we'll have some things we can throw away. CRS was one of them. Basically, the idea for them was to have something in there, that they could throw away. There are some other arguments behind it. But then it was put back in by a representative from, I believe, from South Carolina during the House debate. He submitted it. Now, this is a Southern Democrat, but, someone who voted against the bill, but nevertheless said, I'm relatively soft on civil rights. But he said, what we need is a bill. What we need is something that softens the blow of the federal hammer, right? We need somebody that goes in and says, before we get to legislation, before we get to legal activity, before we get to sanctions, let's see if we can just work this out. And that's basically what this was an agency that ended up being in the Commerce Department that went into communities, primarily in the South, but eventually in other parts of the country, and sort of looked for racial conflicts that they could put out. They started looking primarily at desegregation issues, going into, if there was a theater that refused to allow in blacks, it went in and said, look, let's work something out. In most cases, it was actually very successful. They did a lot of very good work. It ended up being, later on, when sort of the seasons of riots began, it went in and more focused on, trying to suss out why were people rioting, right? And it was somewhat less successful there, but so was everybody else. I mean, it was a very difficult, knotty question to answer. And it was eventually, killed. It was a relatively short-lived agency, but it is, like you said, one of those, it was a sleeper part, but... Oh, I'm sorry, you're right. It was whittled down. I didn't mean it. It was the activism that it undertook was basically... yes, sir.
These are only a toenail of what you're saying, but it is living history. It's on either side of what you're talking about. Once in Washington, I was 12. My dad, he was on business. And he said, I'm going to be busy all day. Why don't you go down there? So I went down there, and I thought, this is really boring. It's like people in suits going all the time. But then all of a sudden, like 6 mules pulling like a hay bale wagon, and 2 very tall black men in good overalls are standing up. Because I figured out you can't sit down unless you have hay bales on. I think I wonder how long we've been doing this. So I figured I'll follow them, and I followed them because they were clearing the street.
Mm-hmm.
So I could get closer. But then years later, I would think, they dumped King Cotton and they went to the mountains out. At least those two did.
Mm-hmm.
And then the next one is your nation on fire. So it's now I started to drive, and my buddy's dad works for the phone company. He's 68, and he got him a van from the phone company in Austin. Still has all the phone company insignia on the rack. And we hear that U Street, everything's on fire.
Mm-hmm.
Now normal people, most people, we can go far away. We're kids, we go, let's go down there and check it out.
Right.
And the
Is that right? Wow. Wow. That's a great story. I wish I had talked to you for the for that book. Because I ran into a few other people who had interesting, great sort of man on the street stories. But that's a fantastic one. Thanks. Student, yes.
School desegregation proceeded very slowly even after Brown versus Board of Ed. Did this bill speed things up a lot after it was passed?
It did. Two things. The first of all was Title IV, which included the requirement that school districts implement timetables, right, for desegregating. That was very much a part of the wish list of civil rights advocates in Washington. It was there from the beginning. And that came with a variety of federal sanctions if they didn't implement them and legal recourse. But it also, Title VI, which at the time was not understood to be an education plank, this was the plank that said federal money cannot be used for discriminatory purposes. Well, at the time, people were thinking, well, that means some aid programs, some farm programs. There actually wasn't that much that fell under that. Well, not long after that, the federal government passed the education bill, or Johnson passed his mammoth education bill, which just opened the floodgates for billions of dollars in federal aid, basically created the federal aid, the federal education sort of infrastructure that we know today. All of that fell under Title VI. And so very quickly, the federal government said, oh, you like this, right? This money that we might have for you? Well, you can't use that in segregated school districts. School districts said, we're not that awful. Or we are awful, but we would really like that money. So we'll desegregate. The one thing that's interesting that the bill didn't include, and it very explicitly didn't include, it included a rule against it, there was a statement that said nothing in this bill can be used to construe forced, or let's say anything against de facto integration, or a de facto segregation, right? So essentially said school districts that are by law segregated will attack those. Anything in the north, things that school districts that are white or black because of residential or class reasons, we won't deal with that. Nevertheless, the bill created a momentum, and the legal history is a pretty complex one, and outside the scope of the book, fortunately, because but very quickly that also became a reality for many school districts in the north. Required busing and school integration across de facto lines. So, yes. Yes, well, this gentleman had his hand up first, but I would like to get another student, so how about two? Yes. Okay, well, we'll talk later. Yes, sir. This is the last one, so make it.
Well, I don't know. Did these racist Southern senators who opposed the bill, did they see their constituency substantially changed by the improved voting sort of system? Did they have to change their opinions, or did they basically remain?
Well, that's a good question, and it's a fascinating one, and it's one where the scholarship has only really started to. The historical scholarship has only really started to approach it. There's actually a lot of really good political science. It's fairly numbers intensive on the changes that emerged after civil rights legislation. I would argue that, though, a lot of the changes that were attributed to the Civil Rights Act in terms of attitudes on the part of politicians were already happening. I mean, it's not that it was at all correct to say the South was becoming less racist or that Jim Crow was fading away, but there certainly were places where political attitudes were changing. You had a lot more people from outside the region moving into the region. You had a lot more just white people who were educated who kind of realized that this was wrong. A lot more money coming in, businesses investing, and businesses saying, look, we don't want to be associated with Jim Crow. And that was all happening by the 50s. What you had, though, by the mid-60s was sort of a dynamic where certain people, let's say more enlightened politicians, like Al Gore Sr. is a great example, someone who voted against the Civil Rights Act, but voted for the Voting Rights Act. And because he saw in the Civil Rights Act, in the passage of the bill and its immediate consequences, evidence of the change that was coming. And he said, I am, by nature a progressive guy. I supported, or I didn't oppose Jim Crow because that was what my voters told me to do. But I now feel like I have the space to become a liberal on civil rights. William Fulbright, in the same way. And there were some surprising people in the Deep South who made that transition. But a lot of others went the other direction and said, look, I actually don't think that business interests are all that interested in, they don't want to be associated with Jim Crow, but they're not progressive. They don't care about really fighting discrimination. They just don't want to be associated with white and black soda fountains. So I'm going to play the minimum. I'm going to say the Civil Rights Act has basically wiped the slate clean, and I'm going to associate myself with the more conservative elements that are out there. And I'm going to make the bet that in the long run, the South changes in terms of the sort of bare minimum racial opinions, but remains a fairly conservative place racially and doesn't change as much on the deep social level as some might expect. And those guys, Strom Thurmond is a great example of someone who said, I'm actually going to switch parties completely. I'm going to go over to the Republicans. And you had a number of Republican politicians or people who were, let's say, up-and-coming politicians who saw this new split emerging and said, I'm going to go with this kind of newly modified, this sort of new Republican Party that is figuring out how to marry small government and racial animosity and how those two can go together under the excuse of, we don't have to talk about this stuff anymore because the Civil Rights Act took care of it all, right? I mean, that's the unfortunate, and I'm not blaming the Civil Rights Act, but it certainly is an unfortunate consequence of the passage of such a landmark bill, is it allowed certain people to say, I don't have to worry about this. I don't have to think about this anymore. I can just say it's all written off. And anyone who tries to raise it as an issue is a pinko, liberal, doesn't belong here in the South, Democrat, right? So that's sort of the way things went. And I don't want to demean the people who really did come to sort of an apotheosis and become racially liberal or adopt racially liberal views as a result of what happened in the 50s and 60s. But they were unfortunately outnumbered by those who took a more cynical perspective. So with that, I guess I will say thank you very much again to Adam and the Starr Center. And I appreciate all of you coming out on such a beautiful day to hear me go on and on about my current obsession. So, thank you.